We're now going to move on to the next speaker, which is Dr. Peter Batt. He's going to talk about the urban food agenda from a global perspective. So we're coming in nearer, but global. So by way of background, Peter was born in Christchurch. He's an independent food systems consultant with an expert in fresh produce and linking smallholder farmers to markets and putting them into what's called collaborative marketing groups. He works across Asia, currently works for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, where he's a global responsibility for the development of the Rapid Urban Food System Appraisal Tool. That's right, isn't it, Peter? Under the Food for Cities programme. He was previously Professor of Food and Agribusiness Marketing at Curtin University. He was there for 30 years. Sometimes in these speakers, it's often nice to just tease out some of the slightly more personal, perhaps interesting, well, I find it interesting, you may not find it interesting, but interesting things about people. So I said to Peter, what's the worst job you've ever had? And usually everyone's got one worst job. And for Peter, it was in the early 1980s, installing waterbeds in New Zealand. I believe that was your worst job. And his claim to fame was playing cricket as a bowler, 5 for 26 off 12 overs, so not bad. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you and good morning. It's lovely to be here and to actually have a chance to talk about what's basically happening at the global level. As the slide presentation is basically titled here, we're talking about this thing called the New Urban Agenda. And I want to take some of the key notes from Julian's presentation. I always find Julian an absolute treasure to start a conversation like this with some of the broad statements about where we're going and basically what we need to do about things. Yes, it's basically predicted by 2050, around 2/3 of humanity are going to live in cities. And fundamentally, that's what we're here today, to talk about a food future for Perth and for Western Australia. A few scary facts, but again, obviously the reality of the situation here, that in terms of talking about cities, yes, as Julian indicated, they're relatively small. They occupy only around 2% of the global land area, but they're responsible for over 70% of the GDP, around 60% of the global energy consumed, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, and 70% of global waste. So I think with those sort of statistics, we ought to be able to do something about all this, and that's really what we obviously need to be doing. We also acknowledge that increasing rates of urbanisation, as Julian's just indicated, are putting increasing pressure on resources. We're seeing the diminishing availability of water and land and the pressure as our cities compete for our food production bowls. And of course, what cities are also doing, ever influencing what we eat, where we eat and when we eat. And we're seeing transition take place in terms of our retail markets, moves towards direct marketing, and of course the big thing in the food industry, convenience. And so of course, as we talk a lot about fast food today, it's sort of mobile phone in one hand, snack bar in the other. That's basically how we're living so much of our society today. And it's that impact then that the food industry is having upon our health and well-being. And again, as Julia's indicated, it's how we hold the fork and what we decide to put in our mouth that's having a significant impact on basically our life more than anything else. When we start talking about these things at a global level, we're talking about what we call the triple burden. And we need to appreciate that probably around 800 million people somewhere in the world are suffering from acute hunger, usually in the Horn of Africa. We've got around about another 1.2 billion that are suffering from what we call malnutrition. So it's not about just food security and having enough food, it's actually about having the right type of food. And so this is where we see all the issues around micronutrient deficiencies, and particularly in much of the developing world, stunting, and of course people just not reaching their full potential. And then as Julian's indicated, the other 1.2 billion and growing is this issue of global obesity. And of course associated with that, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and of course then with increased life and longevity, the increasing social costs associated with our health system. So we have to do something about it, collectively. But the core problem here is that production for so long has been absent from actually the planning that's actually taking place, There's this growing disconnect between fruit consumption and food production. And ultimately, that's what we need to start to solve. Now, of course, most of you would be aware of the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs became, or were officially coming into force in January 2016. There's 17 of these things, and they were basically voted on by the member countries of the United Nations, so that when they're universally applied, we're going to end all forms of poverty in the world. We're going to fight the inequalities, that is the access to food. We're going to tackle climate change, but do it in such a way that no one is left behind. Very idealistic, but these are the things that we have to actually start to shoot towards. So if we start thinking about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals as they impact upon our urban environment, then fundamentally, at least from where the UN's coming from in the Food and Agriculture Organisation, we're focusing on SDG 2, which is fundamentally around zero hunger, and SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities. But of course, what we need to appreciate and understand here is that all of the other SDGs also play a critical role in terms of what we're doing within the food industry. We've got to be able to have employment so that people are gaining income so that they can actually afford food. So we obviously see SDG 8 and SDG 1 starting to come into play. As we've already seen a moment ago in terms of our rising concerns here around well-being and particularly good health, diabetes, heart attacks, etc. Obviously, it's all about good health and nutrition. So SDG 3 starts to kick in. Of course, there's also the issue around education, gender equality, and it's not just having access to food, it's also having access to water. And so SDG 6 starts to come into force. And of course, we also have to think about climate action, SDG 13, and how we can minimise greenhouse gas emissions, and obviously look at how our agricultural production can minimise its impact, because other than energy, agriculture is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. And as we've also seen from Julian, some of the increasing interest here in terms of looking at the aquaculture environment. So these SDGs are really impacting and influencing what's actually happening globally in terms of how we're approaching the whole new thing around urbanisation. In October of 2016, there was the meeting basically of what's called the New Urban Agenda, or Habitat 3 in Quito in Ecuador. And the vision that was agreed, again, by the member states was that all inhabitants of present and future generations, without discrimination of any kind, will be able to inhabit and produce just, safe, healthy, accessible, resilient and sustainable cities that contribute to prosperity and the quality of life. To achieve that vision, we're going to need cities that fulfil their social function, cities that have sufficient infrastructure in terms of transportation systems, sanitation, water, access to safe and clean drinking water. We need food security and nutrition. We've heard a lot already about this focus on nutrition-sensitive diets, NSDs. I often call them no significant difference. The challenge is that to be able to bring about nutrition-sensitive diets, we actually need to understand things from a systems perspective, and we need the right sort of incentives in place to actually impact and influence production to drive that forward. And as Julian's already indicated, we're only looking at about 200 plant species, when in reality there's over 27,000 that could potentially be providing food sources and nutrients for us. So there's an enormous amount of effort that's actually required within this space around food security and nutrition. Education, health, and of course sustainable livelihoods, as I indicated a moment ago. People need to have gainful employment to be able to have the money that they need to be able to purchase the food that they need. But our cities also perform an important civic activity here in terms of creating this sense of belonging and ownership. We need cities that are safe and inclusive. We need cities that are green with quality open space. We need cities that provide an opportunity for social interaction and cultural diversity. We need cities that promote gender equality, that prevent and eliminate all forms of discrimination, violence and harassment against women, that ensure decent work and equal pay for equal work. But we also need cities that can adopt and implement disaster reduction and management strategies. We need to be able to build resilience and responsiveness to natural and man-made hazards. Yes, this is Chittagong, Dhaka, Bangladesh. I was trying to get to work in that sort of environment. Needless to say, you wind up spending your day in the hotel. You can't get to the UN offices when you're up to waist deep in water. But that's the nature of many of the low-lying countries and of the risk proneness that these cities face. We need to be able to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Real challenges that we need to face now. We need to protect, conserve, restore and promote our ecosystems. We need to look again, as we've been hearing so much from Julian already, about the importance of recycling water and how we do more with less. And we need to minimise our environmental impact. So, the new basic urban agenda has basically set the scene, providing the guidelines for how we need to be able to better manage our cities and how we then need to be able to reconnect to agricultural production. But for anyone who works within the UN and has any sort of understanding about how the UN bureaucracy works knows that it is a horrific bureaucracy. It's very, very slow, just as we've sort of seen recently with things like the TPP. It just doesn't happen. There are too many people around the table with too many agendas and we all get bogged down. So what happened concurrent with the new urban agenda was what we describe here as the Milan Urban Food Policy PAC. So what emerged out of the Milan Urban Food Policy PAC was around 120 of the mayors of some of the world's major cities basically decided that they were actually going to start working together. And the signatories undertook to develop sustainable food systems that are inclusive, resilient, safe and diverse, and that provide healthy and affordable food to all people and that minimise waste and conserve biodiversity. What the Milan Food Policy PAC seeks to do is to encourage interdepartmental and cross-sector coordination. So we start to recognise that one of the challenges that we have is somehow getting everybody on the same page and everybody actually starting to work together. Exactly as Julian indicated in his previous presentation, that wicked problem. We all see the elephant in different ways. How can we all start to work together to solve this issue? We need to be able to enhance stakeholder participation and dialogue. And the core aspect of this are what we describe here as these multi-stakeholder platforms, more of which we'll hear about today in terms of how you need to bring these people together in a decision-making forum where ideas can be discussed and people can actually look at developing new ideas, new concepts, and again, we have the dialogue and discussion that is so necessary to bring about and to develop sustainable cities. We need to be able to identify, map and evaluate the movement of food. In other words, we need to think again, as Julian indicated, that we've got these rivers of trucks, of ships and of aircraft bringing the food to the cities, and what happens if? And we know what happens here in Perth, as we saw some years ago, when, of course, we had that flood in inland Australia, the Nullarbor was cut, and of course we realised that in reality, because we eat so much processed food, we've really only got about 2 to 3 days of food left. That's pretty scary. We are not food secure when you actually start to think about it in that perspective. But what we also need to do when we're looking at mapping and evaluating our food movement is identifying what we describe as the hotspots. Where are the issues in our food system where the system breaks down? Where are the issues that food waste is contributed? How can we reduce that waste? And something else that we've really not even spoken about today, but no doubt we'll talk about at length later today, food safety. The importance of knowing that as you take the bite of that that food bar, it's not going to be the last thing that crosses your lips. We also need to improve our information systems. We need good information if we're going to make good decisions. And so we need to have the understanding about where our food comes from. We need to have the understanding about the drivers environmentally, their resource constraints. We also need to have a greater and a much better understanding of consumer motivations. In other words, why is it that we make the decisions that we do in terms of the food choices? And as I've already indicated, we need these disaster risk reduction strategies. We need to do the what-ifs. We need to develop scenarios so that we're better placed to be able to respond to these risks and things when they emerge. So given this environment, the FAO launched in 2016 in conjunction with RUAF, the Food for Cities program. And as Tristan indicated, I'm currently the global consultant responsible for the development of the RUFSAT tool. RUFSAT, the Rapid Urban Food System Appraisal tool that actually will provide the information into the 3 pilot cities that are actually undertaking this program. The program's called NADALI, an acronym taken from the 3 cities that are contributing to the program: Nairobi, Dhaka, and Lima. So what FAO is trying to do then within the Food for Cities program is to create more resilient and inclusive food systems within the urban regions by strengthening the capacity of the local actors to improve food and nutrition security. We need to strengthen, and we've identified the need to obviously strengthen the rural-urban linkages. In other words, we need to understand and we need to work better with smallholder producers, looking towards more inclusive and resilient activities for small-scale agriculture within a local food system, while ensuring that we have a sustainable use of natural resources. As I've already indicated under the Milan Food Pact, we need to have these participatory multi-stakeholder platforms or dialogues. We often talk about the establishment or potential establishment of these things called food policy councils, but we need some forum where we can gather and collectively address the issues. And we need to evaluate, monitor and map our urban food systems so that we understand how the food moves within our cities, but also where the food is produced within our peri-urban areas, and do what we can to protect that. So that when we look fundamentally at our food systems, we're dealing with our food production, we're dealing with our food processing, our distribution and marketing, and consumption. And this is taking place then within an environment where, as I've indicated, we need to be socially inclusive. We need to ensure that all members of the community have equal access to food. We need to be environmentally responsible. We need to think about livelihoods and economic development. And we need to ensure, as I've already indicated, that there is an adequate supply of healthy, nutritious food. We also need to look at, as I've indicated, the importance of interacting with our rural communities, strengthening our transportation technology and communication networks, developing reliable value chains that connect rural supply with urban demand. And we need to strengthen our food system planning. And if we're going to do that, we need to promote an enabling environment that is fair and responsible, so that everybody is taking a fair share of the return from the food industry. There's always this thing that I'm talking or finding myself talking in forums all around the world where everybody wants to shoot the middleman. Nah, leave the middleman alone. They perform a very, very important function in the food distribution supply. And in Dhaka, for example, where I'm currently based, the middleman works on a percentage of between 1% to 2%. That is not sustainable. We need to promote investments, innovation and entrepreneurship. We need to support small to medium-sized enterprises and cooperatives through the value chain. Because again, it's only through bringing smallholder producers into these collaborative marketing groups that we can provide that capacity for them to exchange or to, transact with those who live in the urban environments. We need to support the local provision of goods and basic services. And of course, those of us who live here are very familiar with our Buy West, Eat Best. I must admit that I've actually stolen aspects of this program here to introduce in Bangladesh a thing called Dhaka Best, the same type of principle, a way and a means for recognising producers who implement sustainable business practices. We need to be able to promote the use of these multi-stakeholder platforms. Again, not only does it provide us with the mechanism for communication and dialogue, but if they're going to work well, we need to establish clear and transparent policies, financial administrative frameworks, and we need to establish planning guidelines for these multi-stakeholder partnerships. But if all of this is going to happen, we need to promote capacity development programs. We need to ensure that the people have the skills that they actually need to undertake these urban planning exercises. And if we're going to do that, as I indicated a moment ago, we need information. And so we need to create, promote, and enhance these user-friendly and participatory data platforms where the information is available, and it's available to all. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a very quick introduction to what's basically happening within the global environment and to the Food and Agriculture's organisations' activities within this space. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. I think we've got